Here's a statistic that should terrify every church leader in America. In the last 20 years, women have left Christianity at a higher rate than men, but that's not the whole story. Because while women are leaving, men are leaving faster, and they're not coming back. In 1990, churches were roughly 60% women and 40% men. Today, they're 65% women and 35% men. But the real crisis is in young men. Among men under 35, only 39% identify as Christian. Among men 18 to 24, it's even worse. And the number of men who never attend church at all has tripled in the last 30 years. But here's what's crazy. Nobody's talking about this. Every conversation about religion and gender focuses on why women are leaving, why women feel excluded, why women want to be priests and pastors. And those conversations are important. But meanwhile, men are quietly ghosting the church entirely, and the reasons are completely different. In this video, we're going to explore why Christian men are abandoning the faith, and why it's becoming a crisis that could reshape American Christianity. The data that nobody's discussing. Let me start with the numbers because they're shocking if you really look at them. In 1990, American churches had roughly equal gender representation, or actually slightly skewed male. Men were the spiritual leaders of households. They led prayer. They made faith decisions for their families. When a man converted, often his whole family converted with him. But starting in the 1990s, something shifted. Women began attending church more frequently than men. By 2000, the gap was noticeable. By 2010, it was undeniable. By 2020, it was a chasm. According to Pew Research, which tracks these things carefully, women now make up about 60 to 65% of regular church attendees in America, depending on the denomination. In some mainline Protestant churches, women make up 70% of the congregation. But here's where it gets really interesting. The decline in male church attendance is happening across all age groups, but it's most severe among younger men. Men over 65, still attending church at relatively decent rates. Men 50 to 65, still participating. Men 35 to 50, starting to drop off significantly. Men 25 to 35, barely there. Young men 18 to 24, largely absent. The number of men who never attend church has gone from about 20% in 1990 to nearly 60% today. For women, it's gone from about 15% to about 35%. So both genders are leaving, but men are leaving at nearly twice the rate. And this isn't just a mainline Protestant problem. This is happening in evangelical churches too. This is happening in Catholic churches. This is happening across Christianity. The reasons women are leaving church are pretty well documented. They cite concerns about LGBTQ+ inclusion, reproductive rights, gender equality in leadership, the political alignment of churches with conservative politics. We've heard these stories. There are documentaries, books, TED Talks about it. But when men leave church, it's different, and almost nobody's asking why. So if it's not about reproductive rights or women in leadership, though some men cite those things, why are men leaving the church in such massive numbers? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to a few interconnected factors. First, the feminization of church culture. And I need to be careful here because I'm not saying there's anything wrong with women's participation in church, but there's been a real shift in how church culture has evolved, particularly starting in the 1980s and 1990s. Church became increasingly focused on emotional expression, personal relationships with Jesus, vulnerability, and sharing feelings. Worship became more emotional and expressive. Teaching became more focused on personal spiritual journeys and emotional healing. Church became a place where you talk about your feelings and you're vulnerable with the community. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Emotional expression and vulnerability are healthy. But for a lot of men, particularly traditional men who grew up being taught not to express emotions publicly, this created an uncomfortable cultural environment. Men were told they needed to be sensitive, to talk about their feelings, to be vulnerable in small groups. For a woman who was raised to be more emotionally expressive, this was liberating. For a man who was raised to be stoic and self-reliant, it felt emasculating. The result is that church started to feel like a space designed for women. The music was emotional and relational. The teaching focused on personal spiritual experience. The community-building activities, small groups, prayer circles, coffee hours, had a distinctly feminine energy to them. A lot of men I've talked to describe church as not for people like me. They don't feel comfortable there. It doesn't speak their language. It doesn't address the things they care about. Second, the decline of male leadership and authority. Historically, church was a place where men held power. Priests, pastors, bishops. These were positions of authority held by men. The church reinforced male authority in the home and in society. Men who were church leaders were respected in their communities. But as secularization happened and women began entering ministry in Protestant churches, that changed. The authority of religious leadership diminished in general, but it particularly diminished as a source of male status. A man today can't claim social status from being a deacon or elder the way his grandfather could. Religious authority just doesn't confer the same kind of power or respect. So one of the traditional rewards for male participation in church, social status, and authority, disappeared. Meanwhile, the church became a place where women were gaining influence and leadership. For some men, this felt like the one institution they didn't have to compete with women had been taken over. Third, the politicization of Christianity. This is huge. From the 1980s onward, Christianity became increasingly aligned with conservative Republican politics. The Christian right became a powerful political force. But starting around 2016, that alignment became even more pronounced. Many younger men, particularly educated men and urban men, rejected conservative politics. And when they realized that Christianity had become inseparable from political conservatism, they rejected Christianity too. But here's the thing. Younger men didn't just reject Christianity because of politics. They rejected it because they saw Christianity being used to justify political positions they found morally abhorrent. They saw churches supporting Trump. They saw churches opposing LGBTQ+ rights. They saw churches opposing climate action. They saw churches defending police violence. They saw churches allied with right-wing extremism. For young men who held progressive values, this made Christianity morally compromised. It wasn't that they were offended by the politics. It was that they felt like they couldn't be part of an institution that was complicit in things they believed were wrong. This particularly hit educated, urban, younger men. These are exactly the men who would have been the church leaders of the next generation. But they left because they couldn't reconcile their values with what the church had become. Fourth, competitive masculinity and religious authority. This is more subtle, but it's real. Religion requires a certain kind of submission to God, submission to religious authority, submission to community standards. For a lot of men, particularly competitive, ambitious men, this feels like weakness. Modern culture, particularly for men, emphasizes independence, self-reliance, competitiveness, and dominance. These values are actually antithetical to the values that religion emphasizes: humility, submission, service to others, community over self. A man can be ambitious in business and society while also being humble in his faith. But it requires a particular kind of cognitive flexibility that a lot of men either don't have or don't want to develop. It's easier to just opt out of religion entirely and pursue meaning and identity through work, sports, or secular philosophies that align better with competitive masculinity. Fifth, the lack of male community. This is something that doesn't get talked about enough. Church, at its best, provides community. But modern secular society has largely eliminated male community spaces. Historically, men had spaces where they gathered together: barbershops, bars, clubs, gyms, workplaces. In a lot of places, church was one of the main places where men from different backgrounds gathered regularly. But as society has become more secular and individualistic, a lot of those community spaces have disappeared or become less central to people's lives. And church is one of the few places that could still provide that community. But church has increasingly emphasized smaller, more intimate groups, women's groups, men's groups, couples groups, rather than the whole community gathering. And a lot of men find the smaller groups awkward and emasculating. So men have lost one of the few community spaces available to them, and nothing has replaced it. Sixth, the absence of male role models. Related to the previous point, for a young man, church used to be a place where you'd see successful men serving in leadership roles. You'd see the businessman who was also a deacon. You'd see the teacher who was also a Sunday school leader. You'd see the doctor who was also an elder. These were men who were successful in the world and also committed to faith. They modeled that you could be both. But as men have left the church in larger numbers, the pool of visible male role models in church has shrunk. A young man now looks around his church and sees that most of the men are either older men from a previous generation or men who aren't particularly successful in secular society. This makes it harder for him to see a path where being a church-going man fits with being a successful, respectable man in modern society. Seventh, the anti-intellectualism problem. Young men today, particularly educated young men, are put off by what they perceive as anti-intellectualism in churches. They see churches rejecting science, rejecting scholarship, rejecting critical thinking. A young man with a college education or who wants to get one doesn't want to be part of an institution that asks him to believe things that contradict what he's learning about biology, history, and critical thinking. Science and rational inquiry are extremely valued in modern culture, especially for men. Men are taught to be logical, analytical, and evidence-based. When a church asks you to believe something that contradicts evidence, whether it's about evolution, climate change, vaccines, or biblical scholarship, it creates cognitive dissonance. For women, there are other reasons to stay despite this dissonance. But for men who define themselves through intellectual competence and logical consistency, this dissonance is often a deal-breaker. The personality type that's leaving. So far I've talked about cultural and institutional reasons men are leaving, but there's also a personality component to this. The research shows that the men most likely to leave church are educated, urban, independent-minded, socially progressive, intellectually curious, and ambition-driven. These are exactly the men who would have been the future leaders of the church. Instead, they're leaving. Why? Because modern Christianity, at least as it's typically practiced in American churches, doesn't align with how these men think about the world. Conservative Christianity emphasizes faith over reason, tradition over innovation, authority over questioning, and community conformity over individual conscience. These are values that some people need and want, but they're antithetical to how educated, progressive, intellectually curious men tend to think. Progressive Christianity tries to bridge this gap. It tries to reconcile faith with reason, to encourage questioning and critical thinking, to be socially progressive. And it's attracted some of these men. But progressive Christianity is a much smaller phenomenon than conservative Christianity, and it lacks the institutional resources and cultural presence of conservative Christianity. So what happens is, educated men encounter conservative Christianity and think, "This isn't for me. I can't believe things that contradict evidence. I can't be part of an institution that opposes LGBTQ+ rights and climate action." They look for progressive Christianity and either can't find it or find it too weak and culturally irrelevant. So they leave entirely. Meanwhile, men who are less educated, more traditional, and more culturally conservative might find conservative Christianity perfectly aligned with their worldview. They stay. But their numbers are declining too because society is becoming more secular overall. The result is that church is becoming less diverse intellectually. The men who stay tend to be more traditional and conservative. The men who leave tend to be more progressive and intellectually curious. This creates a feedback loop where churches become more conservative, which drives away more progressive men, which makes churches even more conservative. There's also a class dimension to this. Working-class men and men who've struggled with addiction, incarceration, or other challenges sometimes find church community and salvation transformative. Those men are still coming. But middle-class and upper-middle-class men, the men who have options and alternatives, are increasingly not coming. This is actually really problematic for churches because they're losing exactly the demographic that could provide leadership, financial support, and cultural credibility. They're left with older men, working-class men, and men who lack educational credentials. There's nothing wrong with any of those groups, but they don't provide the kind of leadership pipeline that churches need to thrive. So what happens when men systematically abandon church? First, financial crisis. Men, particularly educated and successful men, have historically been the primary financial supporters of churches. When they leave, church budgets suffer. Lots of churches today are struggling financially not because fewer people are attending, but because fewer men are attending and they were carrying the financial burden. Second, leadership crisis. Churches need leaders. But if men aren't coming, who leads? Churches are trying to fill leadership roles with women and with aging men from previous generations. Some of this works, but it's not sustainable. You can't run an institution long-term if you don't have a pipeline of emerging male leaders. Third, identity and meaning crisis. Men who leave church don't just lose religion. They lose a community and a source of meaning. Some men find those things elsewhere, in secular communities, hobbies, work. But a lot of men don't. They become isolated. They struggle to find meaning and purpose. This contributes to the broader crisis of meaning that a lot of men are experiencing. Fourth, the radicalization risk. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. When men leave mainstream religious communities, where do they go? Some go nowhere, they just become secular. But others find meaning in alternative communities that can be problematic. Some young men who leave church get pulled into online extremist communities. Some get pulled into the manosphere, communities that explicitly reject modern values and promote a return to traditional masculinity. Some get radicalized through internet rabbit holes. This isn't to say that leaving church causes radicalization, but leaving mainstream community institutions does increase vulnerability to radicalization. If a man is isolated and searching for meaning and identity, he's more vulnerable to extremist messaging. And some of the men in these alternative communities explicitly frame them in opposition to Christianity. They see Christianity as weak, feminized, and incompatible with authentic masculinity. So they build counter-communities that reject Christianity entirely. This is a vicious cycle. Church loses men. Men become isolated. Isolated men become vulnerable to extremist communities. Extremist communities teach them to reject Christianity. More men leave church. The cycle continues. Fifth, the demographic collapse risk. If men keep leaving church and women keep having fewer children, churches will eventually shrink to demographic irrelevance. This isn't happening yet, but it's a real long-term trend. Catholic churches have already seen this in some regions. Mainline Protestant churches have seen this. Evangelical churches have been insulated from it somewhat because they have higher birth rates, but that's changing too. In another generation or two, if these trends continue, Christian churches in America could be a much smaller and more marginal institution than they are today. This is the question churches should be asking, but most aren't. What would it take to bring educated, ambitious, progressive young men back into the church? Honestly, I'm not sure it's possible in the current form of Christianity, but here are things that would help. First, churches would need to embrace intellectual integrity. They'd need to stop asking people to believe things that contradict evidence. They'd need to encourage critical thinking rather than discouraging it. This is a huge ask for conservative Christianity, but it's necessary. Second, churches would need to decouple from conservative politics. They'd need to allow for diverse political perspectives within the community. Right now, Many churches are so aligned with Republican politics that progressive men feel unwelcome. That needs to change. Third, churches would need to create male community spaces that don't feel emasculating. This doesn't mean going back to patriarchy or male authority, but it means recognizing that men have legitimate community needs and creating spaces where men can gather and connect without the whole thing being about emotional vulnerability and personal sharing. Sometimes men just want to work on something together to feel competent to be part of a team. Fourth, churches would need to offer something that secular society doesn't offer. Right now, a lot of what church offers, community, meaning, purpose, is available elsewhere. Churches need to figure out what they offer that's genuinely unique and can't be replicated by a secular institution or online community. Fifth, churches would need to produce visible male role models of success. Young men need to see that they can be successful in modern secular society and also be committed to faith. Right now, they mostly don't see that. But here's the thing. Making these changes would fundamentally transform Christianity. It would move it further away from traditional theology and authority structures. Some churches are willing to do that. Many aren't. So I think what we're actually going to see is a bifurcation. Some churches will adapt and attract educated, progressive men. They'll be smaller than they are now, but they'll survive. Other churches will double down on traditional theology and authority, and they'll become increasingly isolated and irrelevant to secular society. Either way, the Christianity of the future will be different from the Christianity of today. And the departure of men from the church is one of the key factors driving that change. The story of why men are leaving church isn't about women taking over. It's not about feminism destroying Christianity. It's about a fundamental mismatch between what modern Christianity offers and what modern men are looking for. It's a story about institutions that haven't adapted to a changing world. It's a story about values misalignment. It's a story about the search for meaning and community in a secular age. And it's a story that will determine what Christianity looks like in America for the next generation. Thanks for watching. If you found this valuable, please subscribe to Christian Faith Archive for more explorations into how faith, culture, and society are changing.